In this episode, we're coming back to the topic of intervals. It's a topic that we took up in the very first episode when we were looking at basic forms of psychoacoustic comparison that our ears make between frequencies. There we talked a lot about the description of intervals in terms of interval ratios of frequency, and we'll be coming back to that topic in the latter part of this particular episode. However, in the intervening time, we were introduced to the concept of diatonic intervals. And just as a reminder of that, we discovered that, for example, you could have two intervals that you could, in a sense, gauge the size of, however inaccurately, just by looking at them on the graph provided by the score. So, for example, we saw 2/5 there and there, and the idea of the diatonic interval was to appreciate the size of an interval by the number of basic pitch locations that were available on the musical staff. Regardless of sharps or flats, I have a space, a line, a space, a line, a space. That's 5 possible positions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's a fifth. Likewise over here, we have 5 positions available, line, space, line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's another fifth. And then we discovered that this was a useful way to look at intervals in the context of mode because you could quickly identify interval size by comparing the appearance of asymmetric and symmetric intervals on the staff. However, what we also noticed was a bit of a problem because even if I could recognize immediately that these are fifths, nonetheless, in the context of a particular clef, suddenly the underlying irregularities of the musical staff come to the fore, and my ear can pick them up quite readily. So the first fifth sounded like this, and the second fifth sounded like this. Very different in interval quality. Generally, this is recognized as a consonant, that is a dissonance, 2 very different kinds of fifth. And then what we decided to do is explore this a little bit more. What's going on? What could explain the difference in the sound qualities? And we found that if I measure the distance in an even fashion, that is, pulling out the information hidden inside the staff, the actual sequence of semitones that connect these, starting in one position, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I discovered that this was a fifth that took me 7 semitones to get from one component of the interval to the other. Whether I started at the bottom and counted up or the top and counted down, doesn't matter. So if this is a fifth, it's a 7 kind of fifth. Over here, I have another fifth, but in this case, it took me just 6 steps to get from one component of the interval to the other. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this was a 6 kind of fifth, and it turns out that a 7 kind of fifth is the one that sounds consonant, and a 6 kind of fifth is the one that sounds dissonant. So this is a little bit cumbersome way of describing these intervals because I'm combining 2 kinds of numbers that sound like they're more or less the same, but they're not. Remember, these kinds of interval counts make no distinction between whole tone or semitone. Also, they encompass the pitch locations of the interval itself, whereas these kinds of counting forms do not encompass the whole interval. We start at one place and we see how many steps it takes to get to the other component. And in this case, we are distinguishing between whole tones and semitones because we're only counting by semitone. We want to have an even metric. So those are 2 fundamental ways in which these kinds of measurements differ from each other. Now, what would be nice is if we could retain all the benefits of diatonic interval size. And remember, they're extraordinary. If you can recognize diatonic intervals at sight in the way that we learned about in episode 5, that is tremendously powerful. If you apply that in the context of mode, you can read at sight rapidly and easily. So we don't want to lose track of that. However, as musicians, up to this point in time, we were kind of relying on the fact that the mode itself would take care of the particular sound characteristics of each of those diatonic intervals. So if I was playing a piece of music that, for example, was in an A minor mode, if I went from the tonic to the fifth scale degree, I would hear a that kind of fifth. And if I went from the second scale degree to the sixth scale degree, I would hear a this kind of fifth. So there is an impact that the mode has. However, it would be nice to be able to say what kind of fifth each of these things are. So we want to come up with another naming system. Now, I'll point out two things. First of all, this kind of indication, remember, is diatonic interval size. It involves the number of pitch locations encompassed on the staff by the interval itself. It pays no attention to the distinction between whole tones and semitones. This form of counting up interval size we call the chromatic size, and that's derived from the idea of building a chromatic scale in between the components of the interval. And the chromatic size is not about the pitch locations encompassed by the interval, it's about how you get from one place to the other. So that's why this isn't an 8 thing. It isn't 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's counting from one standpoint, either here, counting up, or there, counting down. So is there something that we can come up with that conveys this information that we can then use to qualify that information and hang on to the idea of the diatonic interval, which has been so useful to us? Yes, there is. I'm going to take us back to diatonic modes for a moment and remind us that initially, when I was introducing the basic mode types, I talked about Aeolian, Locrian, Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian. And then I said, there's another way in which we can identify Aeolian and Ionian. We can talk about minor and major. So here is a major scale, here is a minor scale, Ionian, Aeolian. And I said at the time that the reason why the names minor and major get applied to these things is because of certain kinds of interval relationships that they contain. And I'm going to show you what I meant by that now. If I look at a scale like this, remember what it's representing is an amount of information that's connected with actual real live music. The amount of information is as follows. I have a diatonic collection. I have a tonic, which provides an order to that collection. Out of that, I get a mode. So I have this reflecting the kind of material that, for example, a melody like this might use. Right? So I was playing that good old Mozart melody, originally in D major, but here I was playing it in C major. So this is organized in this fashion because the framing pitch class C is functioning as the tonic of this scale, which is representing the tonic of that melody I just played. Likewise, here, I'm missing one significant detail. I have a minor mode, which could be used for a melody like this one associated with Bach. Now, you might also recall that I was suggesting how our ears and our minds gradually build a picture of mode. As we listen to a melody, we might not know right off the bat what the tonic is, but over time, a melody, if it's a tonal melody, will gradually inculcate a sense of what the framing pitch or pitch class is, what the tonic will be, and then I judge the underlying interval sequence or mode type in relation to that. So there's a way in which, again, as I represent the scale as just one series of pitches after the other, at the same time what I'm implying is that I will hear these scale degrees, not just by themselves, but in relation to this framing pitch class, there or there. Now, if I do that kind of thing, I start to notice some interesting details. First of all, if I look at things like the tonic, or for example, if I imagine the tonic still being heard here, the octave, those are going to be the same. If I compare the fourth scale degree and fifth scale degree, those sound the same. They are unchanged. It's rather like there is a basic form of unison, octave, fourth, and fifth, a single basic form. Now you might notice as well that the same could be said about the relationship between the second scale degree and the first. Keep in mind that what I'm telling you is just a way to begin to understand these qualifications that we'll be applying to these types of interval. We already know that there are in fact two basic types of second. We've got a whole tone and a semitone, and what I'm seeing right here is simply the whole tone that exists between the tonic or first scale degree and the second scale degree. But if I continued on, of course, I've got semitone there, semitone there. So all I'm trying to do is indicate how some kinds of intervals will stand out as being held in common in relation to the tonic, in particular the unison, fourth, fifth, and octave. We're going to bracket this for the time being. And then what's going to be very different will be those built on scale degree 3, scale degree 6, and scale degree 7. So if I were to play those intervals, third, that in relation to that, sixth, that in relation to the tonic, seventh, that in relation to the tonic. This is what they sound like in a major context. And here's what they would sound like in a minor context. Now, this I can see is a semitone smaller than that, semitone smaller than that, semitone smaller than that. In each case, I have an interval type that's rather like the whole tone semitone distinction. There's no single type of second. We have a larger size, a whole tone, and a smaller size, a semitone. Likewise, for thirds, sixths, and sevenths, I also don't appear to have a single basic size. I've got a larger size and a smaller size. Now, this terminology, major and minor, actually means not that these intervals are coming from major and minor scales. It's the other way around. Major means larger than, specifically larger than something else by a semitone. What is that something else? That's the minor size of interval. Minor means smaller than something else by semitone. What's that something else? Major. We have a category of interval that has no single basic size. There's a larger size, a smaller size, but no single basic size. So remember, the single basic size of interval encompasses unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves. And by the way, I will extend this discussion beyond the octave later on in this episode. We'll discover that what I learn about intervals within the octave can be applied outside of it when we talk about compound intervals, that kind of thing. However, there are these intervals that have a basic size that correspond to a term I introduced right back in episode 1, the perfect intervals, Pythagorean consonances in particular. So unison, fourth, fifth, octave have a single basic size. We refer to those as the perfect intervals. The other types of intervals that do not have a single basic size, seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths, those we refer to as the imperfect intervals, and they have no single basic size. So if I wanted to start to break this down for us, the first thing that we come up with is a category distinction between perfect and imperfect intervals. And the reason why we're doing this is, as you might guess, we wanted to come up with some naming system that we could use to qualify diatonic interval size to make it more precise. So we still want to capture the appearance of diatonic intervals, and that we already categorized in a way between those that appear to be symmetric on the staff and those that appear to be asymmetric. So that was a useful categorical distinction, but that was purely a visual one. What we're interested in right now is an oral distinction. So I can talk about intervals that are diatonic in some sense, but now I want to break that down a little bit more accurately in terms of how they sound, in terms of their chromatic size. And I have this distinction between perfect intervals and imperfect ones. Now, when I first introduced this distinction, that was also back in episode 1. And there I was only talking about consonances, but the idea of the imperfect can be applied to conventionally understood dissonant intervals too, like seconds and sevenths. So just to keep track of that, again, I'm just showing intervals within the octave, the imperfect intervals, seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths. So we've got two dissonances and two conventional consonances there, okay? Now, with the imperfect intervals, because there is no single basic size, what I do here is create another categorical subdivision between major, a larger size, and minor. So this is where the terms for these scales, major, minor, comes from. It's from the prominence of certain intervals, specifically the imperfect intervals, in relation to the underlying tonic that we would hear, above all the thirds and the sixths. However, I mention the sevenths in that context as well, because many people will try to recognize distinctions between imperfect intervals, major and minor, by thinking in their minds of a scale that could be built using them. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. However, this is the first categorical distinction I want to make between the perfect and the imperfect intervals, and then amongst the imperfect intervals between major and minor. So, if I were to start trying to build a larger picture here, I want to remember one thing, and that is the distinction between these two is always a semitone. Major means it's a semitone larger than the minor version. Minor means it's a semitone smaller than the major version. And you might imagine that logically, I should then be able to expand upon these categories a little bit further. And indeed, I can. That will include the perfect intervals. I can have larger or smaller sizes of the perfect intervals. And in that case, since the terms major and minor are associated with the imperfect consonances, I don't want to say, well, I can have a minor perfect fourth or a major perfect fifth. That would be blurring these category distinctions between perfect and imperfect. So what I do there is I use the terms augmented and diminished. So augmented means a semitone larger than something else. Diminished means a semitone smaller than something else. Now, I'm saying larger than something else, smaller than something else, because that something else isn't necessarily just a perfect interval. This framework can also be applied over here. Now, what would not make sense would be for me to say, well, I've got a major imperfect interval of some kind, let's say a major seventh, and then I'm going to diminish it by a semitone. Well, that would make no sense, because if I diminish a major by a semitone, that just turns it into minor. So that makes no sense. However, I can augment major imperfect intervals. Likewise, then, I can diminish imperfect intervals. So this is a kind of overview of the interval categories that we will be working with. So to start out with, we have the distinction between perfect and imperfect intervals. There are different reasons for the use of these terms, but for our purposes, perfect will mean that they have a single basic size, that there is such a thing as a unison, a fourth. Given that, we call it a perfect unison, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, perfect octave. Imperfect intervals, there is no single basic size for, and so we have seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths. I can have a major second or a minor second. I can have a major third or a minor third, a major sixth or a minor sixth, a major seventh or a minor seventh. What that means is that these terms, semitone, can be translated into these terms. So just to keep track, the second part is the diatonic bit. That's the thing that tells me, oh, when I see something on the staff, it is a second of some kind. It's unqualified. Now, when I apply something like that, then I go, right, it's a particular type of second. In this case, it's the larger type of second that would correspond to a whole tone. So we call that the major second. So this is the diatonic component of the interval identity, and this is the chromatic qualification of it. And in this way, I now have the capacity to both enjoy all the benefits of the diatonic intervals, which are incredible, and at the same time be far more accurate as a musician in being able to describe my oral experience of those intervals. So just as I can have perfect intervals and imperfect intervals, after that I can augment or diminish my perfect intervals directly from that single perfect form that they have. With my major and minor, it is possible for me to augment and diminish them, but I can only augment a major, I can only diminish a minor, because if I augment a minor, that turns it into major, and then the term is meaningless, and vice versa. So this kind of terminology is of interest to us because, in fact, when I looked at these two intervals, both were fifths. One was a semitone smaller than the other. This was that fifth that had a chromatic size of 7 semitone steps. That's the size that corresponds with a perfect fifth. I mean, you could imagine an A minor or an A major, doesn't matter, scale starting from A. That is going to be, for example, the fifth that you obtain. Again, I want to stress the fact that this does not mean that you can only have perfect fifths in a major or minor scale, because if I were in fact in A minor, and this is what I pointed out before and why I pointed it out, this is a fifth, but in terms of A minor, for example, that would be an interval between scale degree 2 and scale degree 6. So that is also a fifth, but in this case, it was a semitone smaller. So a semitone smaller than the perfect size makes it diminished. So when we indicate these distinctions shorthand, we tend to use an uppercase letter P for perfect, which I will do there. When it comes to augmented and diminished, augmented we use an uppercase A, diminished a lowercase d. Put that information there too. Therefore, where before I said these are 2 fifths, that's the 7 kind of fifth, that's the 6th kind of fifth, now I can simply say that is a perfect fifth, that is a diminished fifth, and we start to see how this naming system works. over here for major and minor, for our shorthand, we indicate major with an uppercase M and minor with a lowercase m. And when you're drawing these things by hand, to make the distinction clear, it's easy to see the distinction between uppercase A, lowercase d, but m's can start to look a bit similar. Make sure you've got kind of pointy bits for the uppercase m and rounded bits for the lowercase. And that way, when you're doing interval analysis on assignments or exams, it will never be difficult for somebody like me to understand what you intend when you write those, okay? All right, so I have a basic map of how I would like to think about these qualified diatonic intervals, but how can I start to develop that information more precisely? Well, since I know that there are a whole series of semitone relationships here, as it turns out, I already figured out that that perfect fifth is a chromatic size of 7 steps. That's something I can build upon, because if I go down by semitone, I get a diminished fifth. If I happen to do something like this, take that a semitone lower, I do end up with a perfect fourth. Chromatic size 5. And again, in my mind, if I wanted to, I could imagine a scale. In this case, B major, B minor wouldn't matter. Count it up and I would see there are 5 semitone steps to get from one interval to the other. So what I start to notice is this kind of linking pattern of semitones. What I can now do is start to build a kind of chart that will show how these intervals relate to each other by their semitone steps. Now, often what I do in these videos is wipe the board and turn off the camera for that part and redraw it. But what's really important for you is to be able to create this type of interval chart yourself. Let's keep in mind that as a framework, for the time being, we are just thinking in terms of the octave as a kind of upper boundary for the intervals we'll be interested in. We'll extend beyond that later on. But if I think about chromatic size, I know that the octave is what I get after 12 semitone steps. I would also know that a unison is something that I get after no semitone steps. So what I can start to do is create a chart where I can have the basic interval that's derived from a diatonic appearance but qualified by chromatic size, and specifically over here information about that chromatic size itself. So in a sense, this is what is providing that qualification of the diatonic size, all right? So if I start at 0, over here, I'm going to have a perfect unison that corresponds with that. So I'm going to have qualified diatonic interval sizes that correspond with each of the available semitone steps. So since I want to go up to an octave, I'm going to have 12 of these things. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So to start out with, I know where my 0 position is. That's the perfect unison. I know where my 12th step is. That is at the perfect octave, okay? Now, what I also know is the particular examples I was working with, I was just showing to you, were the perfect fifth, diminished fifth, and the perfect fourth. They were clustered right around here. So right in the middle of this, I know at 6 steps up, I had a diminished fifth. And I know that just above that, I had a perfect fifth, and a semitone below that, I had a perfect fourth. So that's going to give me a kind of node that I can build outwards from. However, right away, I notice something very important. That is, I can have a diminished fifth, but I could also have, conceivably, an augmented fourth. I'll give you a quick example of that. Here is a perfect fifth, chromatic size 7. Here is now a diminished fifth, chromatic size 6. It is written as a fifth. If I happen to shift this enharmonically, like so, it retains the same chromatic size, but I can no longer identify it in terms of a fifth. What it is plainly a fourth. It's one of those asymmetric diatonic intervals. One component of the interval is on a line, the other's on a space. I look at that, I say, that's a fourth. So it has to be some kind of fourth, but it can't be this kind of fourth because the chromatic size is 6. It is a semitone larger than that. This is an augmented fourth. Now, you might say, why does this matter? Because if I play that by itself, you don't know whether I played an augmented fourth or a diminished fifth first. In fact, you don't know if I played the same interval twice. Even worse, I don't know because I can't tell. Given equal temperament, the D sharp and the E flat are perfectly and harmonically equivalent. I can't hear any distinction between them. So why might I want to make a distinction about whether something is an augmented fourth or a diminished fifth? Two things. Normally, where I will be hearing an interval like that is not just on some theory exam, but in the context of a piece of music. And so, for example, an augmented fourth would probably be heard in a context like that, and as a trained musician, for reasons that I will get into much later on, what I heard was this thing resolving upwards by a step, that thing resolving downwards by a step as a part of a harmonic sequence. In my ear, I would recognize a kind of pattern that would tell me, conventionally that's an augmented fourth that was used. If I heard something like this, that would tell me that specifically what I was working with was a diminished fifth, again, because of how it behaved in musical context. So when you come to know harmonic practices, contrapuntal practices more and more, these kinds of distinctions matter a great deal. Likewise, at a very basic level, you want musicians to be able to read music at sight very comfortably, usually assuming a kind of context of accidentals being used. And I'll be talking about that context quite a bit more in the next episode when we look at diatonic collections and the use of things called key signatures. But for example, I would encounter something like this interval in a melody that happened to be, for example, in E major. If I was moving from scale degree 4 to scale degree 7, that is the interval that would be formed. It would utterly confuse me in this context to say, well, you know, the augmented fourth, the diminished fifth, they're enharmonically equivalent, doesn't matter, I'm going to write that. If my expectation is that I'm in E major and suddenly I see an E flat, I'm going to be very confused by that, especially if this E flat is supposed to be part of the diatonic collection. That will make no sense to me. Likewise, if I were working with something like a piece of music that was in B flat major, get all the scale degrees down here. This is an interval that I would likely encounter if my melody continued on up to that point. That is a diminished fifth. That's not an augmented fourth. It appears as that. I would never, in the context of ordinary use of B flat major, write something like this. That would confuse me. So this is why we need to be able to distinguish between these apparent and harmonic equivalents. And we're going to be doing that throughout our chart. It's so that we can preserve the consistency of context that we rely on to be able to read diatonic interval size quickly and easily. Okay? So that's why it's important. That's why it matters. Now, if I were to continue developing this chart, there's some basic pieces of information that I could put in right away. I already understand that semitone corresponds with a minor second, whole tone corresponds with a major second. So there's my semitone, there's my whole tone, and essentially I can just build up from there. Next step up, ordinarily speaking, would be the smaller size of third, semitone larger than a major second. A semitone larger than the minor third, of course, is the major third. A semitone larger than the perfect fifth, normally speaking, would be a minor sixth. I want to write that as clearly as possible, like I told you to with the rounded M bits. If I go a semitone larger than that, I'm going to have a major sixth. Next step up will take me to a minor seventh, and then a semitone larger than that will be a major seventh. So this is how I can come up very quickly with an accurate chart that will characterize these diatonic interval sizes through their precise chromatic coordinates. All right? There are a couple of other pieces of information that I should put in here. This is one way in which we have an enharmonic equivalent. These are both very common intervals, the diminished fifth and the augmented fourth. There are other enharmonic variants that are very common. So for example, here when I was just building my basic interval sequence, I was going from the smaller size of imperfect interval to the larger size, smaller, larger, smaller, larger, smaller, larger. However, remember that even the imperfect intervals themselves can have augmented or diminished versions. And for example, a very common interval is the augmented second. So for example, you might remember that when we were learning about minor scales, if I had a plain vanilla C minor scale, I was going to turn that into harmonic minor. What I was doing there was playing a C harmonic minor scale. If I look at that interval right there, I can see right away that is a major second. It's a whole tone. When I turn it into a harmonic minor scale, in that fashion, that's a semitone larger than a major second. That is an augmented second. So that's a very common interval. Likewise, there's a whole category of chord types that are built within something called an augmented sixth. Those chord types sound like something that to our ear might at first sound like a minor seventh, but in fact they're written in such a way that they're going to behave differently. So that's why again, the enharmonic equivalence is there, but it will be notated differently depending on the particular musical context you're working with. I'll give you an example of that. What I first played was that, a minor seventh, and that's something that would be relatively easy to recognize, for example, if you know your A flat minor scale. However, the other thing that I played was this. So again, I look at that, I can see it's one of those symmetric diatonic intervals. Both components of the interval are in the same feature of the staff. They're both on spaces, too far apart to be a unison, a third, or a fifth. It's a seventh of some kind. It's a minor seventh. Here I have to understand that as some type of sixth. There's no way around it. But I note this enharmonic equivalence. This can't be a major sixth because it is, this is getting a little bit sloppy here. Because, well, here's what I'll do. I'll just draw these lines here. That's where I was getting a bit sloppy. Apologies for that. So you can see the correspondences. This is not interval size 9. It can't be. That would have to be an F. Since it's chromatic size 10, it is a semitone larger than a major sixth. That is an augmented sixth. I'm going to leave that up on the board for a moment because I'm going to use that as a jumping off point for the next topic that I'll get to. Likewise, there's something else that can happen in this area. A very popular type of chord is called a diminished seventh. A little bit of Joplin again for you. Can't play too much of it or I'll get in trouble with the copyright bots, I'm sure. A diminished seventh is something, it's an interval, that it occupies the same amount of chromatic space as a major sixth. Try to fix this in here. And so, for example, actually no, I'll leave that in place. Here is a seventh of some type. Happens to be a major seventh as it currently stands. You could imagine in your mind, say an F major scale, and that's a semitone below the top. So that is this size of seventh, chromatic size 11. By the way, I put this information, the chromatic size, in square brackets underneath, not because you need to do that. I mean, this is what characterizes that for us, okay? If it's a seventh that happens to be major, it is that size. I'm just putting that in there to help us keep track. If I do this, right, that makes this a size smaller. That would be a minor seventh. And then, if I wanted to diminish that, there are two things that I could do. I could do this, which would turn it into a diminished seventh. And chromatic size now would be reduced to 9. And that clearly is not a sixth of any type, because it's one of those symmetrically appearing intervals. It's a seventh of some kind. It has to be understood as, in terms of a seventh, it is a diminished seventh. I can create it that way, but I could also do something else. And here I will introduce the last two accidentals that you need to know about. Rather than making this a semitone smaller by raising that, I could lower that a step further. A double flat. So remember, when we have accidentals, they refer to something that's a given and you modify it by a semitone. If I have a sharp, that means whatever I had before is a semitone larger. If I have a flat, whatever I had before is a semitone smaller. If I have a double flat, like this, that means now it is a semitone smaller than the previous version. It's a semitone narrower than the flat that used to be there. So it's essentially indicating going down by a whole step or a whole tone. So that's one way in which I could create a diminished seventh. The other thing that I could do is go back to what I had originally. That's my major seventh, interval size 11. Now I have a minor seventh, interval size 10. And then I can do the same thing. Just like I can have double flats, I can have double sharps. You'll see them when they're professionally printed out by notation programs. They kind of look often sort of, I can't really draw it well, like a sharp sign kind of turned on its side of it. What we tend to do by hand is just write an X, okay? So if you see that by hand, that means not single sharp, but double sharp. And again, that is a diminished seventh, chromatic size 9, okay? Now, what I want you to notice is that, let's say I remove all of this information. Oops, I want to keep track of what I originally had here. So I have a couple of diminished sevenths. I have an augmented sixth. There are ways in which I can still try to imagine using scales as a sort of framework to judge interval size and then modify them a step further. What's tricky about that is that if I think in terms of scales, major and minor, my thinking does not normally encompass things like a combination of sharps and flats, because the scales that I've been thinking in terms of, major and minor, they're diatonic. They're not going to be mixing up different types of accidentals, and certainly not, in any conventional sense, double flats and double sharps. So one of the things that we are going to want to do is find some other way to quickly count up interval size and make sure that we're getting these intervals accurate and correct. Now, what you can do, of course, is try to do that on the staff itself and go, okay, between these two intervals, I got A flat, I have A natural, and then, I don't know, A sharp, and then B, and then C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, I don't know, E sharp or F, and then finally I'm back, okay, now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, okay, I know what size this thing is. It's a sixth that has chromatic size 10, it's an augmented sixth. That was a lot of work, that took a lot of time. What I can do, of course, is think about things like, well, if I were in A flat major, that would be a major sixth, so that would be interval size 9, and therefore if I do something like that, that's going to move it up a step, and it's moving it from major sixth to augmented sixth. I can do that as well, but there's one other thing that I can do, and that is to actually use a kind of stylized keyboard as a calculating device to get the size of the interval correct. And I mention this because, again, based on many years of seeing student exams, I've noticed a lot of students doing this kind of thing just to make sure that they get the chromatic size count accurately. And it's also, I think, a way in which they can do that physically that really reinforces the fact that, yes, I have gone up 10 steps. But I just want to point out one more thing before I show you that means of calculation, and that is these are the kind of standard diatonic interval sizes qualified by chromatic size that we encounter. They are not the only type of diatonic interval sizes that we will find qualified in this way. This kind of chart is trying to give the minimal amount of information necessary to be useful to us, not putting in absolutely everything that can be there. But for example, there are lots of times where, for all sorts of good reasons, composers will want to modify these kinds of intervals. So for example, it isn't always going to be the case that I am going to encounter a perfect octave. A composer whose music I know relatively well, Bela Bartok, often loved to write things like diminished octaves, or also augmented octaves. There will be times where, for the purposes of this course, I will give you assignments where what you want to be able to do is say, well, I know how to create a basic interval chart for myself. However, when I need to, I can modify this information. I can extend it using the same logic that I've applied before. So if on my standard interval chart, I've only got a perfect octave noted there, well, if I see something that looks like an octave, therefore must be described in those terms as an octave of some type, if I see that the chromatic size is a semitone smaller than what it ought to be perfect, well, that makes it automatically a diminished octave. Or here I've got something that steps beyond what this basic chart gives me. Only 12 chromatic steps are available here. I've got 13. Nonetheless, what I see is an augmented octave, and so I extend that upwards by a semitone larger than the perfect size makes it augmented. So that's how I can use the logic that's becomes the framework for this chart to extend it into new directions. And in that way, I don't have to make it too cluttered. I mean, the minor third, augmented second, diminished fifth, augmented fourth, major sixth, diminished seventh, minor seventh, augmented sixth. These are standard enharmonic equivalent uses. You'll encounter them a lot, but they are not the full extent of variations that you can encounter there. So as long as you apply that logic, you will be fine. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you is another way to count up interval sizes. And again, where I normally wipe off the board and leave that bit out of the video, I want you to see how I actually draw the next bit of information. Just like I wanted you to see the chart being constructed, what I'm going to construct for you is a keyboard. Now, there is a parallel series of videos on the website that I've mentioned before, Keyboard-Based Music Theory, where I show you how to make use of the design of the piano keyboard as a kind of theory tool, which I think can be useful in lots of ways. So if you haven't checked out those videos before, now would definitely be a good time to do so. Also, they will help prepare you for the next topic, the development of these things called key signatures. But there, in those videos, I'm actually working with a real live keyboard. I just kind of perched the iPhone over top of it and played things. What can you do if you're sitting for an exam and you don't have a piano right there and you want to work with one? What can you create? Well, keep in mind a point that I made back in episode 2, which is that in a way, graphic notation is kind of like a tablature for keyboards. Why? Because on keyboards, we have a distinction between white keys and black keys, and the white keys correspond with the unaltered lines and spaces of a regular staff. So if I see something like this, and I see a bunch of notes like these, I know that on a piano, I am simply going to be playing white keys, all right? So what that means is that a piano, because it has both white and black keys, physically shows the gaps that are hidden underneath the diatonic surface of the regular staff, right? We've got hidden semitones in there, right? So if I were to draw a keyboard, this is what I do. I draw just an octave worth of keyboard, and I do that by creating a nice sort of oblong box, okay? I divide it in half, and then I proceed by more halves. I divide each of those sections in half, and then everything there in half again. So now what I have is a representation for 8 white keys. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, if you look at a conventional keyboard, you'll see that there are black keys, but it isn't white, black, white, black, white, black, white, black. There are clusters of black keys that come in clusters of 2 and 3, and they regularly alternate. So you can draw these in for yourself. And you can see with your own eyes precisely where the B's and the C's and the E's and the F's are, because there's no black key in between to play some missing pitch or pitch class. The question is which is which? Which is E and F and which is B and C? Well, if you look at the clusters of 2 and 3 black keys, you can know that below the cluster of 2 is C, below the cluster of 3 is F. So there's E, and of course, counting all the way up, there's my B and my C. D is right there. So what that means is that if I have something like this interval, actually I'll start with a more basic one. There's the fifth. The question I want to ask myself is, well, which kind of fifth is it? Well, if I look at my keyboard, I can go right. One of those notes is D, and if I want to count the chromatic size, I can just go from there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I've gone from D to A. I have a chromatic size of 7. I can look at the chart I've made for myself, and I know that's not just the fifth, that is a perfect fifth. I could make things a little bit more juicy if I wanted to. I could go from A flat to F sharp. I know that's some type of sixth just by looking at it. It's one of those asymmetric intervals, and I can just see at sight. It's far enough apart that it can't be a second or a fourth, not far enough apart to make an octave. It's a sixth of some kind, but what kind of sixth? So here's something where you need to pay a little bit more close attention to how you count things. Starting with A flat, which is there, I want to get to F sharp. So remember, we have that idea of enharmonic equivalence. This could be a C sharp, a D flat, this could be a D sharp, or an E flat, this can be an F sharp, or a G flat, it can be a G sharp, or an A flat. You don't have to put this information in. I mean, it's just something that will make good logical sense if you figure this part out. A sharp, B flat. Okay, I want to get from an A flat to an F sharp. Now, I don't go this way. I'm trying to get this distance in place, but I only have one octave, one register available to me here. So what I do is I start with A flat, and remember, when you're counting chromatic size, you don't count your starting place. You are beginning from somewhere, and you count your steps away from it. So I'm here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I tunnel back to this C. This C is being treated as the same thing. It's as though I'm just continuing up the octave. It just means I don't have to draw 2 octaves worth of keyboard. Keep it simple. So I'm here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I arrive at F sharp. I know it is an augmented sixth then by consulting my chart. If it had been G flat instead, well, it would have been some kind of seventh. I would have come up with exactly the same count, and I would have known we've got a minor seventh. So this is how you can use a handy little keyboard to make certain that you're getting those interval sizes correct. Like I say, the option is to think about going back to the major and minor scales, imagining the lower pitch as a tonic, and then if you need to, make some sort of modification. Where things will get tricky is if you have something like a version of diminished seventh the major seventh, interval size 11. Then I made it into a minor seventh. Then I did the double sharp, which made it into a diminished seventh, right? Now, if I look at something like this, again, I know it's a seventh of some type. What type is it? I can use a keyboard in a way a little bit more easily than I can imagine this by pairing it with a scale. I mean, what scale do I know that starts with F double sharp? Oh, okay, then I have to think about going down at least to F sharp, so that means whatever the higher note is, and I have to take that thing down. And my mind might get confused. Here, if I use the keyboard chart, I can deal with this relatively easily because I can say, right, F double sharp, well that's F sharp. Logically, of course, the double sharp is enharmonically equivalent with G. So I start from there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, that's chromatic size 9. Check my chart. It's a diminished seventh. So the keyboard can be extremely useful when trying to do mental comparisons with scales gets a bit tricky. Now, the other thing that we want to keep in mind is that these interval qualities that we've been talking about, all of them have been constrained within the compass of an octave. How can we extend those ideas to intervals beyond the octave? Well, we'll do that by, in a sense, paying attention to what our ears tell us about them. For example, if I have an interval like this, a major third, and I create a kind of version of that where the notes, rather than being close together, are farther apart, specifically the pitch classes C and E. I've simply moved E up the octave, and I get an interval of a tenth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. How does that thing sound? Here's the major third. And even though these notes are much further apart, the interval is more widely spaced, it still sounds as though it's retaining the same underlying interval quality. So I would call this a major tenth. Now, sometimes some people will say, well, you can also capture that sense of retaining the quality of the major third, just separated by an octave, by saying that is a compound major third, okay? In that case, what you're doing is saying, all right, it does sound like a major third, but just kind of made that much larger. The one limitation of that, of course, is that it kind of privileges the major third and says, well, somehow we're hearing things in terms of that, rather than acknowledging that the major tenth by itself has its own very nice sound quality, and maybe we should think of the major third as a narrower version of the major tenth. These kinds of spacing issues become very important when you write for many instruments in very different ranges, because sometimes the spacing of an interval matters a great deal. It will be heard with much more clarity, for example, if it's further apart when you're producing things in a lower register. Although sometimes you'll get composers like Beethoven who like to kind of munch things together into a very tight space because of the sort of impact it has. So, for example, his Waldstein sonata starts with a whole lot of intervals jammed into a very tight space down in a low register. But Beethoven is playing around with the perception of interval distance by having things sound as though they are kind of constrained in too small of a space, and then suddenly he has a fragment of a melody leaping in much further away. So there's a kind of registral dissonance that he's establishing there. So these kinds of distinctions between thirds and tenths and much larger intervals matter a great deal to composers, not just in terms of how things sound with respect to the instruments or voices they're working with, but sometimes with the kinds of effects they want to create. Anyhow, we can understand that if what we've learned about the third within the octave is extended by an octave, so long as the two pitches are remaining in the same orientation with respect to each other, that is to say that this is still below that, as it is over there, then we retain the same interval quality and we can apply it to the new diatonic size, in this case a tenth, or we can refer to it as the compound third, compound major third. Likewise, I can do that with my old friend, the perfect fifth, which I can then turn into a perfect 12th in that case. And that's the, by the way, the original Pythagorean ratio of 1 to 3. Okay, what happens, however, if I could also understand that, of course, as a compound perfect fifth. What happens, however, if the orientation changes? This is really significant. Yes, these are the same pitch classes, both cases, but they are retaining their same position relative to each other. What if that shifts? What if instead of moving the third up an octave, what if instead I move the lower pitch, the octave? So now I've created a sixth of some kind. If that happened over here, retaining G, but pitch class C, tunneling upwards and above it, what happens? Now, I'm going to start with this case first, because what we're dealing with is something that's called interval inversion, which means that we are changing the position of the constituent elements of the interval with respect to each other. So what had been below before now comes above. This type of inversion we'll come to know as harmonic inversion later on, because it plays a great role in the creation of what we call chord inversions. We'll get there in episode 12. But what I notice here is that what had been a perfect fifth now turns into a fourth. What kind of fourth? Significantly, a perfect fourth. For perfect intervals, under inversion, the quality is retained. You'll note that these numbers sum to 9, but the interval quality remains the same. Over here, however, I've gone from a major third to a minor sixth. These numbers still sum to 9, but significantly, the interval quality has changed. So under inversion, imperfect intervals change their interval quality from one quality to the other, from major to minor, vice versa. Perfect intervals retain the same one. So this is something worthwhile keeping in mind, because it's very different from what we were doing before when we were creating these compound intervals. We were extending those out in space, but they were retaining their relationship with each other. Here, something very important has happened. That relationship has altered, and as a result, we have to pay closer attention to the interval quality. Now, up to this point, what I've been doing is working with a kind of expansion of what we learned about diatonic intervals in episode 5. However, I just referred to Pythagorean ratios. Remember I said that the perfect 12th corresponds with the Pythagorean ratio, frequency ratio, at least 1 to 3. If the original Pythagorean ratios are conceived in terms of string length, that would be the ratio 3 to 1. But why did I not talk about Pythagorean ratios before that point in time? Why have I been using all of this sort of language rather than referring to those ratios? It's for a very good reason, and that is these kinds of interval qualities are in fact very imprecise. What they are recording is our impressions of interval that have been established in the context of a particular system of tuning that we know of as equal temperament. And this is why sometimes when people get introduced to the Pythagorean ratios, they start to learn things like this. we're told, okay, 1 to 1, that's the unison. I'm going to go with the frequency ratios. Ratio 1 to 2, they're told that's the perfect octave. Ratio 2 to 3, they're told that's the perfect fifth. Ratio 3 to 4, they're told that's the perfect fourth. Continuing on to the imperfect consonants, ratio 4 to 5, they're told that that's the major third. Ratio 5 to 6, that that's the minor third. Ratio 3 to 5, told that's the major sixth. And ratio 5 to 8, that is the minor sixth. So this is something that you'll see in a lot of textbooks, certainly all over the internet. What isn't right about it is that these are fundamentally different categories. These are very precise frequency ratios. These are not. It is often the case that what will sound like a decent enough perfect fifth to us is not in fact in that frequency ratio, or what will sound like good enough minor sixth is not in that type of ratio. And that matters a great deal because for many musicians, they will move from one zone to another without often being guided along the way, being shown what is happening. These kinds of identities come out of the psychoacoustic world. So you might remember that distinction that I drew in episode 1 between the acoustic and the psychoacoustic. This is a kind of mapping that takes place in the psychoacoustic realm. I can have perfect fifths that are in that ratio. I can have acceptable perfect fifths that are not. So for example, on a piano, here is C, D, E, F, G. That is a perfect fifth. It is not, in fact, in that ratio. I mentioned before that pitch class relationships, right? Just as a reminder, 1 to 2 to the n, where n is greater than or equal to 0. Pitch class relationships, at least within a middle range, tend to be preserved in these types of precise ratios. However, I forgot to include 1 to 4, which would be known as the perfect double octave. Just 8 times 2. These tend to be preserved in more or less precise ratios because they preserve the pitch class relationship for us. However, even those kinds of ratios, when you get to extremes in range, tend not to preserve that because our ear can accept them in a less precise form. So what is going on in this relationship between the acoustic realm and the psychoacoustic realm that makes it possible for me to accept all sorts of intervals that are not of this form? And why does it matter? This comes down to very practical music making, and what we need to do in the final section of this episode is return to the theme of ratios, especially ratios of the consonances, back from episode 1, because they actually directly impact how we tune our instruments or conceivably mistune them. So that's going to be the final topic that I take up in this episode. So we've developed a rather nuanced and sophisticated way to describe intervals, beginning from diatonic intervals that we can recognize easily off the staff. We've learned how to qualify them so that we can reveal the hidden features of the staff and be able to tell the difference between different sizes of diatonic intervals that leave different kinds of aesthetic impressions on us. This all seems great. Why on earth would we ever want to go back to our first introduction to intervals when we were working with ratios of string length, frequency ratios? Well, to give you some sense of this, I want to share a couple of experiences I had growing up as a musician. Most of my life I've been a piano player. However, I started out by studying the violin. And I have to say, I've always had a gigantic respect for people who learn an instrument like the violin because at a basic level, it's just so much more challenging to play than the piano. The piano is an instrument in which I was initially self-taught because you just go up to it, press your fingers down, and you get notes coming straight out. When I was learning the violin, it was such a challenge learning how to hold the instrument, how to get a decent grip on the bow, how to get a nice tone. And then when I was trying to play the fingerboard and the violin, I had to work so hard to figure out exactly where to put my fingers. Also, on top of all of that, I actually had to tune my instrument every time that I played it, which is something that I never did, thankfully, when I went down to practice a piano. So one thing that struck me very early on was that as a violinist, I needed to be a very good musician. I needed to use my ears very carefully and to try to create intervals as clearly as possible from tuning the strings on the instrument, which I did by tightening or loosening the strings with a tuning peg up at the scroll. And then when I was playing the instrument, I had to judge intervals as accurately as I could by ear. Now, to me, the tuning and the playing were related components. For example, when I was tuning my violin, I had 4 strings to work with: a G string, a D string, an A string, and an E string. And as you can probably tell by listening to that, since I started with a G, then to the D, D to the A to the E, I learned to tune those in perfect fifths. Therefore, when I would try to play perfect fifths on the violin, since there weren't keys anywhere along the fingerboard, remember this is different from a guitar or a lute, which has a fretboard. The frets can tell you where to place your fingers. There's nothing like that on the violin, and so you have to use your ear to very carefully judge whether you've put your fingers in the right place or not. So what I learned from tuning the instrument, tuning the strings in relation to one another, I then use as a basis for how to finger and play the instrument. Now, that seemed very harmonious until I first started to play with a teacher who would begin to accompany me at the piano. And I didn't know why, but I found it quite challenging and a bit frustrating because I often seemed to be out of tune with the piano. And I still remember this as being one of the great frustrations of learning the violin. I seemed to be doing just fine when I was on my own. I was very proud of the acuity of my ear, my capacity to judge intervals. And then when I was playing with the piano, I kept finding it really taxing and difficult. Skip a couple of years later, I gave up on the violin. I went with the piano because, as I mentioned, I was able to teach myself the basics of piano playing, no problem. Got a teacher, was learning how to play all sorts of wonderful pieces. And then one day, the ghost of my violinist past came back to haunt me. The piano that we had at home was coming a little bit out of tune, and I thought I could save my mother some money if I tuned it myself. So a piano also has these tuning pegs, and they're underneath the lid of any piano close to the keyboard, and you get a little tool that kind of fits like a socket over these tuning pegs, and you adjust the strings by turning the peg. So you adjust the tension of them by using this little lever to twist and turn those things. And then you play the notes and judge it by ear. So again, going back to my violin days, I decided that it would be a good idea, since I was a well-trained musician by this point, to judge things as accurately and as carefully as I could, and that I would save my mother a lot of money, and she would be so happy and proud that I tuned the piano for her. So I started off on this process as though I were tuning a violin. And the piano has many more strings. And as I proceeded, I was sure I was doing things right until I would start to compare earlier pitches that I tuned with later ones. And after a certain series of them, it seemed as though something was going wrong. And so I would start back at the beginning and redo that sequence. And I would say, no, well, that sounds right. So maybe now that I've gotten to the end of the sequence, it sounds out of tune with the beginning. I will go back and change that tuning and then change everything else according to it and keep going. And so gradually what I did was to detune the piano, and of course cost my mother a lot more money. So what happened? What went wrong? Because I was sure that I knew what I was doing. I was sure that I was judging things very accurately with my ear, and yet somehow I kept producing errors, and instead of making things better, it was as though I kept accumulating even more errors that made things even more catastrophic. Well, what I didn't know was that what we judge by our ear isn't sufficient to create a harmonious whole. I'll give you an analogy with this. We've often heard of a term like the music of the spheres, or more specifically, the harmony of the spheres, something harmonious about the movements of the planets and the idea of these spheres in which they are embedded in old astronomy. Sounds very pleasing, that everything fits together very well. But one thing you're probably aware of is that when you look at a calendar, we have months that are of different days. And not just 30 and 31 in a seemingly odd order, but also sometimes this month 28 days that we have in February, and even that's not good enough. Sometimes that has to be 29 days. So it's kind of like the year is one great big interval that's been subdivided into different parts. And I can't help noticing that the year conventionally is subdivided into 12 parts, into 12 months, just like an octave for us is subdivided into 12 semitones. Now here's an important difference. Our semitones in the modern tuning system that we work with are all equidistant from one another. We call that equal temperament. A calendar is not equally tempered, I suppose, because it would be very awkward to try to create perfectly even months and then have partial days and things like that. It just wouldn't make sense. Well, what stands behind that? Where does that problem come from? Well, as you might know, we have two fundamental bases for developing most calendars. We have the solar year, and we have what could be called the lunar year, or what happens if you have 12 complete phases of the moon. So using one naturally observed phenomenon to subdivide another. So we can observe the solar year. It's very handy because if we keep track of it, we know when it's winter, spring, summer, and fall. That seems to be a kind of natural way to subdivide the immensity of time for us. But if we want to subdivide within that yearly limit, what else can we turn to? We can look at the moon. Now, here's the thing. If we consider phases of the moon, to go through a complete lunar cycle 12 times adds up to 354 days, approximately. And of course, approximately the solar year, as we know, is 365 and a quarter days. It's going to be made up for every fourth year or leap year, and even that's not quite accurate enough. So what I'm noticing here is a discrepancy of some type. We call that a comma, which means, in this case, a gap. And that is a problem because what I would like to have is something that would work out so that these two natural cycles fit with one another, that they would, in a sense, form a unison, if you will, that the ratio of lunar days per 12 lunar phases and a full solar year would equal one another, but they don't. They're out of sync with each other. And so this is the fundamental problem that any calendar maker has to confront. How do you divide up your year? Do you base it totally on lunar phases? Because if you do that, you have a lunar calendar, and many cultures do have that. However, the solar year is kind of a helpful thing because, again, if you're interested in keeping track of summer, winter, fall, etc., knowing when to plant your seeds and when to harvest, the solar year has a very meaningful relationship to the natural world. So both things seem to make good sense. I can pay attention to the sun, I can pay attention to the moon. They seem like natural components of a method for dividing up time, and I could use one to subdivide the other. But since they don't arrive at a unison of days, I have to come up with other solutions. And so this is why we end up having different lengths of month. Now, if I were to imagine something similar on piano, I could imagine 12 perfect fifths adding up to something. And I'll play them on the piano so you can hear that. I'll start with C. G, D, A, E, B, F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, D sharp, A sharp. I suppose I could say E sharp and B sharp. Well, of course, B sharp, as we know, is enharmonically equivalent with C. So a cycle of 12 perfect fifths on the piano, ultimately, if it started at C, ended up at a C 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 octaves higher. So it's almost like the octaves of the pitch class relationship can be subdivided into 12 distinct pitch classes through the use of the perfect fifth. So there's a way in which, if I imagine the pitch class relationship being used to create a framework of some type, well, that's a unified thing, call it C, but I want to have all these other notes in between, all these other possibilities for pitch classes. If I actually go through perfect fifths in a sequence like that, 12 of them, what I do generate are 12 distinct pitch classes. So then if I take this whole thing and collapse it down within one octave, what I ought to get is a neat subdivision into 12 distinct pitch classes. Exactly what I would like to get on any conventional piano that I can then repeat in all registers. So that's the idea, okay? Why would I choose fifths? Handy that there are 12 of them, but couldn't I come up with that sequence some other way? Well, one of the things I'm trying to imagine is taking that experience that I had as a young violinist and applying it to the keyboard, meaning that as a trained musician, I get very good at judging consonant intervals well, especially things like perfect fifths. I can tell when they're a little bit out. And so that's something that I can use to tune my violin strings, and then of course I apply that to how I played the violin. But this is something that I could apply to a piano as well. If I wanted to tune these strings as perfectly as possible, then this ought to add up to ultimately the pitch class relationship. Where I began, I end up back there again in a higher register. It's kind of closing a circle in a way. And yet, you might have heard that when I was counting up these intervals and saying, all right, I'm doing a perfect fifth here, perfect fifth there, perfect fifth there, I did end up with some rather weird things. Instead of an F, I had an E sharp. Instead of a C at the top, I had a B sharp. And I said, well, don't worry about it. E sharp, enharmonically equivalent with F, B sharp, enharmonically equivalent with C. And of course, the piano proves that. Well, the problem is the piano that I've just played that on is not tuning those fifths the way I would tune my violin strings initially. I was trained to use my ear to judge those intervals as acutely as possible, and a music theorist or a music tuner would say I was seeking to put them in a just form, like it sounds exactly right. That's the way the interval should be, okay? Now, that approach is something that will only lead to grief if I try to do the same thing with another interval. The example I used on the piano was the perfect octave. Now, in general, intervals of the pitch class relationship, unison through the multiple octaves, are retained in their just or most pure form in most tunings, especially, as I mentioned before, in the middle registers of the instrument where our hearing is most acute. When you get to the extreme ranges, we have these things called stretched octaves where it just gives you a little bit more room to monkey around with other tuning possibilities. Now, because of that, the idea is to preserve the identity of the pitch class, that I actually can have a meaningful thing called the note C, whether I hear it down there, or up here, or up there, or down there, or up there. Think of how much we have relied on that idea throughout this course so far. So I want to preserve that in that just form as much as possible. However, you might also think, well, I'd also like to have these other intervals judged in exactly the same way. But if I try to do that, if I try to tune my instrument by using the same principles, the same aesthetic judgment, I want to have the fifths as pure as possible, I'm going to run into this kind of problem. So this is the comma or gap that we have between the lunar year and the solar year. The corresponding comma that we have, if we try to tune through a series of 7 perfect octaves and 12 perfect fifths, approximates to that. And that is a particular type of gap or comma. It's known as the Pythagorean comma. So the Pythagorean comma is a natural phenomenon in the same sense that the lunar calendar by itself does not add up to the solar year. Okay? There's just nothing that we can do about it. Nature is naturally out of harmony with itself, and then we need to make adjustments to fit these things together. The same thing happens with respect to the Pythagorean comma. There's a gap here that somehow needs to be distributed in an acceptable way, just like we have slightly different units in our sizes of month throughout all the intervals of our tuning system. Now again, the reason why we tend to judge tunings or attunements by listening to consonant intervals is because those are the kinds of intervals that we can judge very accurately by ear, be very fussy about. To build up a tuning system through semitones is actually very difficult to do by ear. To get that exactly right is extremely difficult unless you use a calculating device of some kind. Whereas to tune a violin by ear, once you get accustomed to it, it makes perfectly good sense without needing any kind of special measuring device. So what I'm interested in particular is the fact that there's something about the piano keyboard that in a sense lies to me about what the actual pitch relationships are beneath the surface. It's trying to preserve the pitch class relationship as much as possible. So, you know, if I did go from C to a G by whatever means, that G that I arrive at, I would want it to have its pitch class associates all in just tuning throughout the keyboard. But how I get from that C to that G is going to depend very much on context. Now, there are different kinds of tuning contexts. If we try to keep intervals in the most just form possible, that is the form that we would choose by ear, that is something that we call just intonation. Anything else that is kind of slightly bending the quality of the intervals is something that we generally refer to by the term temperament. And so temperament is something that does what a standard calendar does nowadays to the lunar months. It shapes them in some way so that ultimately things will fit together on either side. Both sides of the balance sheet will equal out. I'll give you an example of how we can check for this kind of thing. Let's imagine that I was going to be going back in time to when I decided to tune the piano with this borrowed tuning tool that I had. And I would start out by trying to tune up constituents of an octave in this fashion. I'm imagining this representing 3 strings on the piano. And if I were tuning that by ear, it would not be too difficult, because now if I go back to my Pythagorean ratios, I'll go with the frequency ratios. I would know that if things were exactly right, then this should be in the ratio 2 to 3, perfect fifth, and this should be 3 to 4, the perfect fourth. But now I want to clarify why I've been making that distinction between the Pythagorean ratios themselves and these much more vague terms like perfect fifth, perfect fourth. This is not the perfect fifth. This is only the perfect fifth when the perfect fifth is in just tuning. In fact, the fifth that I just played for you is not in that ratio. To my ear now it sounds relatively okay. If I were tuning my violin, that would be a fail. Here, what I have is not a perfect fourth, it is a justly tuned perfect fourth. And of course, that plus that should add up, as we see, to this, the justly tuned perfect octave. Now, there's a way in which I can check the math of that. This would be going back to grade 8 math, for those of you that did your math training in Canada. Ratios you add up by multiplying. So I can express this as a kind of equation where I have to be sure to multiply the corresponding terms, right? So often what school students are taught is, well, you can express ratios as fractions, even though they're not fractions, but it kind of helps you to visualize what it is you're working with. So I could rewrite that as this. And that way I make sure that I'm multiplying the correct term. So 2 times 3 is 6, 3 times 4 is 12. Does that equal 1 to 2? Yes, indeed, it does. What the math tells me is that if I use my tuning device to tighten up the strings so that they sound exactly right to me, a beautiful perfect fifth, a beautiful perfect fourth, both in just intonation, then I will have created an octave as well, and everything will fit together very well. So thus far, this seems to be a-okay. There will be no problems, and that's part of the problem, in fact, because I start out that way, everything is sounding like it works fine. I'm going to keep going. So what happens if you do keep going? To help keep track of this idea, I'm going to imagine that I have 2 different instruments that will want to be in tune with each other. So I'm going to imagine one instrument has a couple of broken strings. It has only 3 left to play with, and the other has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? So 3-stringed instrument, 5-stringed instrument, and they want to be able to play with each other. Well, if I were to represent what their open strings would sound like if plucked, I could say that they both want to start in the same place and end in the same place. Let's imagine they both want to have this kind of low C, C2, for their lowest string. This instrument only has 3 strings to work with. 2 are broken. So how about we make, actually I'm going to move, that's awfully low. I'm going to move it up an octave. Put it there and there. So what I'm suggesting is that if someone is tuning these strings by ear and getting it as accurate as possible, they really want these things to sound like the pitch class C. Well, that means that that should be in that ratio, that should be in that ratio, and of course, as we know, the ratio for the double octave in double perfect octave in just intonation is 1 to 4. And we can double check that by multiplying these to each other to make them add, right? And of course 1 squared to 2 squared is 1 to 4, so that checks out. That player will have no problems tuning in that way. But this person has 5 strings to work with and wants to end up at the same place. So this person is going to use some different sizes of interval to try to get there, to build a kind of interval staircase to reach that higher note. They want to use consonant intervals, so they're going to go with a justly tuned perfect fifth, another justly tuned perfect fifth, another justly tuned perfect fifth, and then that only leaves room for, I've got to be consistent, putting always the small number first, a justly tuned minor third at the end. So then the equation will read, does this plus that plus that plus that add up to the same thing I have over here? That's to say that those three perfect fifths, 1, 2, 3, so multiply them by themselves, plus in quotation marks because these are ratios, we multiply them, the ratio for the justly tuned minor third, will that in fact equal this, what we're desiring to get at? Because remember, these instruments want to make certain that their lowest and their higher strings are in tune with each other, because that way, if they are, they'll know they'll be able to play music together, okay? So then, if I want to develop this idea, I can check it out mathematically as well. So again, I'll rewrite it using fractions so that I can keep track of the numbers that I'm working with. And I'll do it in a few stages. The first thing I'll come out with, of course, is this cubic relationship. And then I can go to the next step. And right away, I notice a problem of some kind. Specifically, I would have expected this to be something more like 40 to 160, which I could then rationalize to 1 over 4. But it's not quite right. It seems to be out a little bit. There's something not completely right there. Now, how much is it out? Well, just like we can add up these interval ratios by multiplying them, we can subtract them by inverting and multiplying. So I could take this result and say, okay, essentially that minus this, in some sense, means invert and multiply. And what I discover is that there is a clearly defined gap that I can rationalize to 80 to 81. Remember, what I'm looking for as I add these things up is hopefully a unison. When I was doing, I'll do it over here, this other sequence, I mean, yes, this was supposed to add up to the justly tuned perfect double octave, but what I ultimately wanted to have as a result was to hope for this to be the same thing, meaning that when I got there, they would be in tune with each other. They would produce the same pitch. But instead, what I've discovered is that the actual ratio is going to be more like that. That is another type of comma. Remember, the Pythagorean comma is a pretty large one. That one was approximately 77 eightieths. Okay. But the actual numbers for the Pythagorean comma, they're both 6-digit terms in the 500,000, so it's quite a complex pair of numbers. But this seems to be a much smaller size of error, and yet that type of error, it has a special name. It's called a syntonic comma. This one is interesting because that's one of the earliest types of gaps to appear. It's kind of a comma that appears on the way to ultimately creating a Pythagorean comma. So actually you don't have to go too far beyond the initial stages of tuning to start to introduce commas into the systems because of the natural discontinuities in these interval cycles with respect to each other. They are, in a sense, by nature, out of tune with each other. So what you have to then do to make things add up is either avoid a certain interval and load all of the comma on that interval in particular, and then just say, okay, I'm never going to play that interval, and that's what essentially just intonation systems do. They pack all of the error into one comma within one interval and say, all right, just avoid that interval and we'll just play our music using all these other ones. Or you decide that this kind of comma problem is something that you will distribute in some fashion amongst all of the other intervals. Now here's the thing. You have many possible choices that you can make. And for that reason, there is a term that's often misunderstood. When I played a Bach theme for you from a fugue, that was from a collection of pieces called the Well-Tempered Clavier. And it's not clavier because it's not French, it's German. So that's the tempered of temperament, well-tempered clavier. What does that mean? Does it mean a keyboard? It's what that means. It's a sort of generic term for an instrument that has a fixed tuning system that's then manipulated by keys. By fixed tuning system, I mean that once the tension is set on all the strings, you can't change them while you're in the midst of playing them. On a violin, in a sense, I'm constantly changing my tuning depending on where I put my fingers, and that can be for better or worse in the case of a player like myself. But on a piano, once the tuning is set, it's there, and therefore it means that you have to make hard choices right off the deck in terms of how you're going to organize your tuning system. Well, what does well-tempered mean? What well-tempered refers to is the idea of temperament. Temperament meaning, just as a reminder, that the intervals are not being kept in their just or pure state. Therefore, they're being changed in shape in some ways. So just like we have the months of the calendar being kind of bent to ultimately fit into the solar year, they are, we could say, tempered months. However, our months are not all of the same length. So we could say that the standard modern Western calendar is a well-tempered calendar. It's not equal tempered. The months are not of equal lengths. They are not equal subdivisions of a full solar year. So well-tempered does not mean what we have been assuming in this course. Well-tempered means that you can make choices as to how you distribute your Pythagorean comma. You can make some intervals more pure than other ones and by different ways. And so when Bach wrote this collection of pieces, it's not just the pieces themselves, but even within them, he often had very complex modulations taking place, and they were designed as a kind of training exercise for keyboard players, because remember how I said when I was learning music, one of the challenges of the violin was that, I had to do the tuning myself. When I went to the piano, the tuning was done for me. Well, that's in the modern day. Back in Bach's time, one of the fundamental skills you'd have to learn as a keyboard player was how to tune your instrument. And you would have to make special decisions depending on the piece of music that you were tuning for. So it was considered a fundamental aspect of musical training, and that is what this collection of pieces, actually there are 2 volumes, book 1 and book 2, that was in a sense what they were designed for. It was to develop that tremendous skill set that you would need to go through a piece of music and figure out, well, what kind of temperament would work for this. Now, later on, there was a fad that has stayed with us ever since for something called equal temperament. So note that Bach wrote something called the well-tempered clavier and not the equal-tempered clavier. There's a significant difference. They are not the same thing. Equal temperament was first developed around the year 1607 by a Dutch mathematician named Simon Steven. And what it corresponded with was, if I have something like this to describe the frequency ratio for the justly tuned perfect octave, well, we know based on the kinds of calculations we've done before that if this is to be subdivided into 12 equal parts, then those 12 equal parts multiplied by themselves should add up to that. What that means then is if I want to divide that into 12 equal parts, equal semitones, then I need the 12th root of that to discover what the ratio is between any two pitches that are an equal semitone apart. So that means ultimately that is the ratio for the equally tempered semitone. Now that idea is something that was more of an abstract notion at this time, although there were some lute tunings that approximated this from the previous generation of musicians in the late Renaissance. But this design for music tuning, equal temperament, is something that becomes increasingly popular in the 19th century. Why? It's partly because music harmonically and in terms of movement between different areas, things called keys, which we'll be talking about more in the very next episode, as that aspect of music became more complex, the challenges of well-tempering instruments, and not just single keyboards, but whole orchestras and stuff like that, became so challenging that it made sense to come up with a sort of industrial solution that would take care of everything. Equal temperament, specifically, is taking the Pythagorean comma and distributing it equally amongst all of those semitones. And what that means is, because it's taking place within the compass of the justly tuned perfect octave, the octaves themselves, that are smaller components of a larger pitch class relationship, they can retain that precise just tuning, all right? So in this sense, justly tuned perfect octaves provide the framework for equal temperament. However, within those octaves, and we can define them starting on any pitch that we decide to, the relationships inside are all going to be reflecting some equal sub-distribution of the Pythagorean comma. And that's why when we were, for example, listening to that little segment of raga at the end of the previous episode, it sounded so cool compared to me trying to play that mode type on the piano. Played on the sitar is using a tuning that's not equally tempered, and as a result, a lot of the interval qualities are just so much brighter and richer. I mean, it sounds absolutely magical in a way that piano can't. The piano is going to have to reach into a different bag of tricks to make itself sound magical. But just the intervals alone on that sitar sounded absolutely wonderful. So that was a well-tempered sitar that was highlighting certain key interval relationships at the expense of other ones. These are the kinds of choices that you can make. Now, even if equal temperament is something that has become sort of the norm nowadays, you might recall when I was introducing the idea of enharmonically equivalent intervals, I was saying, well, you know, it's going to depend on context whether I can judge if an interval were a diminished fifth or an augmented fourth. And I gave the example of how the diminished fifth would resolve one way, the augmented fourth would resolve itself some other way. Diminished fifth. These are very different harmonic contexts. But I said I would have to hear the resolution to be able to figure out which is which. Well, actually, On a piano, yes, but any good violinist is not constrained purely by equal temperament. If you listen to really great players like, Hilary Hahn or Maxim Vengerov, and I highly recommend that you do, they are constantly making micro adjustments to their tuning. So even if they're working overall in a larger, equally tempered environment, they will make subtle distinctions between, for example, an E flat and a D sharp to kind of flavor the interval in such a way that it's tending more toward one side rather than the other, and our ears will respond to that. It's one reason why I often find an instrument like the violin so lively just at the purely acoustic level, because it can make all these fine gradations. Now, I have to say that it is possible to make fine gradations that sound really good in the hands of a Maxim Vengerov or a Hilary Hahn, but it's also possible, as I mentioned before, to get them drastically wrong. So for example, you might think that these kinds of discrepancies from a unison ratio are not that bad, are not that appreciable to our ears. So what I want to do to convince you otherwise is to play a couple of tuning experiments for you that I did with a digital harpsichord, where I could input directly the type of tuning that I wanted to work with. One, I just cheated and asked for equal temperament. The other, I actually tried to set up the tuning myself. So I'm going to play these two things for you. Both are actually excerpts from a particular selection from Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. And the first thing that you're going to hear is the cheat method, just using equal temperament and seeing how it sounds. So I just have to walk around the piano to give you the sound sample of that. Here is an equal tempered version of this piece of music. Okay, now what I'm going to do is take us to my own version of it, which unfortunately is not constrained by a smart program. It relied completely on me tuning up a system by ear. Okay, and here's what it sounds like. So what you're hearing is a kind of haphazard distribution of the Pythagorean comma. Sometimes the distribution is reasonably acceptable, sort of okay, I can put up with it. At other times, it's kind of gathered up a little bit too much of the comma in one place, and some intervals actually sound really distasteful. So it sounds, in a word, unprofessional. It isn't the case that the computer is making mistakes in the notes that it plays. It's just the framework that I've set up for it makes it sound as though it is making mistakes. So it's a little bit like, you've probably heard the story of the princess in the pea. If you haven't, I'll tell it to you now. It's a folk tale about some young woman who shows up at the door of a castle, and it's a dark and stormy night, and she doesn't have any fancy clothes on. She's soaking wet and muddy, and she asks to be let into the castle and says, you don't have to worry about me. I'm actually a princess, but something bad happened. My carriage went off the road, and here I am alone. I need some help. And so the noble family that takes her in, they're being good hosts, and they say, why, certainly, come on in. But they want to make certain that she actually is a princess and not just pretending to be one. So the story goes that they give her this bed where they just pile on the mattresses so that she can be as comfortable as possible. But between the two lowest mattresses, they put in a dried pea, and they slip that thing in. and wait to see what the results will be in the morning. So they welcome the princess in, give her food, put her to bed. The next morning they get up and they're having breakfast together, and they say, "So, how was your sleep last night?" And the princess is trying to be very polite. She says, "Oh, well, it was very nice, thank you. I had a pretty good sleep." And they said, "Are you sure? Was the temperature in the room fine?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, the temperature was just fine. Everything was fine, thank you." And they said, "Is there anything bothering you at all?" And the princess says, "Well, actually, I felt something digging into my back a little bit." And then, supposedly, because she displayed such sensitivity, they knew she was actually a princess. I tell you that story because as musicians, we are all princesses in that sense. If we hear these kinds of slight mistunings, where these commas are not skillfully distributed, it's like we are hitting these P's and having them dig into our back as though we were princesses. Of course, our back is our eardrum. Is something about it that's disturbing us. Now, one of the aspects of living in an equal-tempered environment is that our ears can become dulled to that. But as I discovered when I was learning how to play the violin, if I actually make an effort to try to play intervals as well as possible or to sing as clearly as possible, I discover why, in fact, I was having problems playing with someone on a fixed tuning strategy like the piano. I was still trying to play these very precise princess intervals, if you will, and they weren't bending themselves to the will of equal temperament. It is possible to kind of reawaken our sensitivity to that in productive ways, like listening to a great Indian raga or learning to tune our instruments. By the way, you can still tune instruments in more than one fashion. You know, a guitar, you can tune those strings by ear, but the real tuning ultimately is built into the series of frets. Those are organized in such a way to provide a temperament. So whatever you do with the strings, as soon as you start using the fretboard, that fretboard is determining the use of the strings, and that is a distinction between how I was originally learning the violin, where I was tuning the strings and then playing them in the same way because there are no frets. On a guitar, that would not be the case. Although, of course, you can reposition your fingers in lots of different ways. You don't have to absolutely obey the frets. But ultimately, what we're interested in is the fact that there is a kind of hidden world of potential tunings that's out there, and this is a particularly good age to be aware of that, because with the advent of digital music sources, we can actually make all sorts of new tuning choices available to ourselves and explore these different worlds of sound. So let's not forget that once again, there is this kind of category distinction between the acoustic and the psychoacoustic. Most of the interval discussion that we've been having in this particular episode has been inhabiting the psychoacoustic world and building kind of maps for that terrain. What we've just done is remind ourselves of how through tuning and temperament, there is an acoustic world that we're still in contact with and that we can still engage with and shape in very distinctive ways.